Hi guys, we're starting a new unit on heredity, which is the way that traits are inherited from generation to generation. We're going to start by looking at some of the history of heredity. Gregor Mendel is considered the father of heredity. He was alive in the 19th century, from 1822 to 1884. He was a monk but also a scientist, and he really liked to garden. And so he studied pea plants and how characteristics are inherited from generation to generation. The pea plants that he studied had a number of different characteristics, different colored flowers, different colored peas, wrinkled peas, smooth peas, different height of the plants, a number of different things. And when he looked at how those traits were passed on from generation to generation, he could make some generalizations. And that work that he did is really the foundation of about heredity today. There were two laws that came out of his work. The first is the law of segregation, which says that chromosome pairs separate independently during the formation of gametes. So I want you to think back and think of the process where gametes are formed. What is it? It's meiosis, right? I know you all remember that. And so what the law of segregation says basically is during meiosis, when the homologous pairs of chromosomes line up, they can line up really whichever way they want. So you could have the blue chromosomes on one side, red on the other, or some could line up, some of the blue on one side, some of the blue on the other. And what happens then is when the gametes are formed, you have a number of different combinations of which chromosome ends up in which gamete. And so that allows for some genetic diversity. And then the second law of heredity is the law of independent assortment, which says that separate genes for separate traits are passed on independently of one another. So remember, one of the traits that Mendel looked at was the color of the peas on the plants, yellow or green, and then another of the traits was whether the peas were wrinkled or smooth. And so this law of independent assortment just says that the smoothness and the color are two traits, and those traits are inherited independently of one another. So even though we're starting out with parent peas that one is smooth and yellow, one is wrinkled and green, we can end up with all the different combinations of those two. We can get smooth green, smooth green, smooth yellow, or wrinkled yellow, wrinkled green. And we'll be talking about how to figure out the combinations of each of those traits. But just in general, that different traits are inherited independently of one another. There is an exception to that, and that's when the genes are linked on the same chromosome. So if genes are located on the same chromosome, they are going to be inherited together because they come together on that chromosome. Some important terms to understand for our study of heredity is, first of all, a gene. A gene is a piece of DNA that determines a trait. That you should already be familiar with. But the next term, allele, is different forms of a gene. So let's say that, so these are homologous chromosomes, and right here is a gene on that chromosome. There are different forms. There's dominant and recessive alleles. And so for each gene on our chromosomes, we have two alleles for that gene. We have one on the chromosome we got from our mom, one on the chromosome we got from our dad. Recessive alleles are the ones that can be masked by the dominant allele. And dominant alleles are the ones that can mask a recessive allele. So that's a little bit confusing at first, but when we look at some examples, it'll become more clear. This example is of the color of the flower on a pea plant. You can either have purple flowers or white flowers. The purple allele is the dominant allele. So if you have one of each allele, a dominant allele and a recessive allele, so you're heterozygous, that's the word for having one of each allele. If you're heterozygous for this flower color, you're going to show, that plant is going to show the dominant allele, so it's showing the purple color. Whereas if you're homozygous dominant, having having two copies of the dominant allele. So homozygous is having two of the same allele. And if those two alleles you have are the dominant allele, then you still have purple flowers. But the recessive allele, the one that's masked in the heterozygous, if you're homozygous recessive, having two copies of the recessive allele, then is the only time when the white color is shown. So again, dominant alleles mask the recessive alleles. The genotype is the actual allelic combination. So we have over here 3 different genotypes. We have homozygous dominant, heterozygous in these two, and then homozygous recessive here. But the phenotype, the physical characteristic, we only have 2 phenotypes over here. We have 3 dominant phenotypes, 3 showing the purple flowers, and 1 recessive phenotype showing the white flowers. And I remember that phenotype is physical because they both start with pH. We'll get lots of practice looking at these terms and examples later in this unit. So if you feel like you just got a whole bunch of new information, maybe you go through this video one more time and practice the different terms and make sure you understand them. We'll get more practice in class tomorrow. Have a good night.